came here so excited to find love, and I'm leaving alone.
Elise is sitting there with about an hour left before the airport, and the relationship is already telling the truth before either of them says it out loud. She is exhausted, hurt, and trying to understand how she got to this point, but the detail that really lands is not even the breakup yet. It is the fact that Josh is gone. He left the apartment right before she had to go. His location is off. She does not know where he is. She does not know if he is coming back. And that kind of silence does something that words almost cannot. It makes a person feel abandoned before they are officially left. That is what makes this opening hit harder than a normal breakup scene. It is not loud. It is not dramatic in the obvious way. It is just one woman sitting with the feeling that she may already be alone, and now the clock is moving. That is a brutal position to be in, because she is not only dealing with pain, she is dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be worse than an argument, because at least an argument admits that both people are still in the same emotional room. This does not feel like that. This feels like Josh has stepped out of the room completely, and maybe out of the relationship with it. And that is where the bigger question starts creeping in. What exactly does it mean when somebody leaves at the most sensitive moment possible? Maybe he felt overwhelmed. Maybe he wanted space. Maybe he thought one more conversation would just make things worse. Those are the softer explanations. But the timing makes those explanations hard to trust, because he did not leave on some random afternoon. He left right before the airport, right before the goodbye, right before the point where he would have had to sit in the consequences of everything that already went wrong. That is why his absence does not feel neutral. It feels like a message. And people do send messages with behavior long before they send them with words. Turning off the location matters. Leaving when time is running out matters. Making the other person wonder whether they will even see you again before they fly out matters. Even if Josh comes back later with an explanation, the emotional damage is already in motion. Because Elise is now stuck in that ugly mental loop that heartbreak creates. Is he coming back? Is he done? Did he leave because he feels bad? Or because he just does not want to deal with me anymore? Was this a bad decision? Or was it the clearest sign yet that he checked out before she did? That is the thing about moments like this. They force a person to stop listening to what the relationship was supposed to be and start looking at what it feels like right now. And right now, for Elise, it feels humiliating. She came all this way hoping for love, hoping for clarity, hoping maybe that the hard parts could still turn into something solid. But this final hour is not giving her reassurance. It is giving her a disappearing man and a growing sense that she has been trying to hold together something he is no longer protecting. And the hardest part is that this kind of exit creates its own emotional trap. Because when somebody vanishes like this, the person left behind starts doing all the work. They start guessing motives. They start trying to be fair. They start asking whether they are overreacting. Maybe he just needed air. Maybe he is stressed too. Maybe he will come back and explain everything. That mental bargaining can make somebody stay softer than the situation deserves. It buys the other person time without requiring effort from them. And that is why this moment matters so much. Elise is already carrying the emotional weight alone, even before the goodbye scene begins. There is also something else sitting under this, and it is not small. The fear that the real story happened before this morning even started. Because people usually do not disappear out of nowhere. They disappear after something has already shifted. That is why this opening works so well emotionally. It does not feel like the beginning of a conflict. It feels like the aftershock of one. The silence in the apartment is telling us there was damage before the camera fully caught up. The missing location, the missing boyfriend, the missing certainty. None of that feels random. And once that thought gets in your head, the whole moment changes. Now the question is not just where Josh is. The question is what happened badly enough that leaving felt easier to him than staying. Did he run because he felt guilty? Did he leave because he knew Elise was done? Did he panic at the idea of one final emotional conversation? Or did he simply not care enough to be present for the hardest part? Those possibilities are not equal. Some are ugly. Some are just weak. But none of them make this feel better for Elise. They all lead to the same emotional reality. When she needed presence, she got absence. And that is why this opening has so much sting to it. It is not built on a huge twist. It is built on emotional exposure. Elise is in the apartment with barely any time left, and every passing minute turns his silence into something louder. At first, it looks like confusion. Then it starts to feel personal. Then it starts to feel like the relationship may have already ended in his behavior before either one of them had the nerve to say it. Because once somebody leaves you alone in a moment like this, you cannot help asking the question that really matters. Is this a man who is struggling? Or is this a man showing you exactly how little emotional protection you can expect from him when it counts most? And just when that question starts to settle in, the story gets worse. Because this morning did not come out of nowhere. The real damage was already waiting in what happened the night before. The missing person angle from that morning already felt bad, but the reason underneath it is what really changes the story. Because now we are not just dealing with a guy who stepped out before the airport. We are dealing with what happened the night before, and that is where this starts feeling less like confusion and more like disrespect you can actually point to. Elise says Josh invited friends over on their final night together. Not just friends in some harmless background way either. The night turned into a full social scene while she ended up in the bedroom crying by herself. And that detail matters because it takes the emotional damage out of the abstract. She is not guessing anymore. She is not sitting there wondering if maybe he got overwhelmed and handled it badly. She is describing a situation where she was physically in the same apartment and still emotionally shut out. That is a very different kind of hurt. A lot of bad relationship moments come down to tone. This one comes down to priority. That is why it hits so hard. On the last night before she leaves the country, there should not be much confusion about what matters most. Even people who are messy, awkward, or emotionally clumsy usually understand that final nights are sensitive. You do not need a perfect boyfriend to get that. You just need a basic sense of emotional timing. And that is what makes Josh's choice land so badly. He did not just make the night uncomfortable. He made Elise feel like she had to compete with noise, people, and chaos on the one night that should have been protected. And once you picture that scene clearly, the emotional math gets ugly fast. Elise is crying in the bedroom. Josh keeps the gathering going. People are there. The relationship is clearly not okay. And instead of shutting it down and making space for the person he says he loves, he lets the night drift further away from anything intimate or safe. That is why this does not feel like a minor mistake. It feels like a moment where behavior revealed hierarchy. She was not first. Now, to be fair, there are still questions inside this. One of them is whether Elise agreed to the gathering before it happened. That does matter, at least on the surface. Because if she said yes earlier, then the night becomes more complicated than a simple ambush. But even that does not clean Josh up the way some people might want it to. Because agreeing in theory is not the same as feeling emotionally okay once the situation actually unfolds. A person can say fine, have your friends over, and then realize very quickly that the tone of the night is wrong, the energy is wrong, and the relationship is too fragile for that kind of scene. That kind of shift is human. It does not automatically make her irrational. And that is where this story gets sharper. Because the obvious version is easy. Josh likes to party, Josh made a stupid choice, Josh hurt her feelings. That may all be true. But the harder question is whether this was only a careless mistake, or whether the party itself was doing emotional work for him. In other words, was this just bad judgment, or was it a way to avoid closeness on a night that demanded too much honesty? That second possibility is the one that lingers, because noise can be useful when somebody does not want intimacy. Other people in the room can break tension, blur accountability, and give a person somewhere to hide. If the relationship already felt strained after dinner, then bringing friends over does not just look reckless, it starts to look convenient. Convenient for somebody who would rather manage discomfort with distraction than sit down and face what the relationship actually feels like. That does not mean Josh sat there plotting some cold strategy like a cartoon villain. Life is usually less neat than that. People often dodge emotional pressure without fully admitting that is what they are doing. They reach for what feels easier. A drink, a party, other people, laughter that covers tension. anything that keeps them from sitting in a room with the one person who needs answers. And that is why intent only gets him so far here. Whether he meant to hurt her or not, the effect still tells the story. Elise was crying alone while he stayed inside a scene that made her feel even more separate. And there's another detail that makes the whole thing feel worse: the presence of other women on the final night. That does not have to mean anything romantic to be painful. It is painful because of what it signals in that moment. It says the atmosphere mattered more than the emotional reality right in front of him. It says public energy took priority over private repair. And if you are Elise in that situation, you are not just upset because people came over. You are asking yourself a much uglier question. Why did this man need this kind of social chaos tonight of all nights? That question is what turns embarrassment into something deeper. Because once a person feels replaceable, they stop reacting only to the event and start reacting to what the event seems to prove. Maybe that is why this landed so hard for Elise. Not just because the night was ruined, but because the ruined night seemed to confirm a fear that had probably been building already. That when emotional pressure shows up, Josh reaches away from her instead of toward her. And to be fair again, Elise is not presented as some calm, flawless victim who never reacts badly. That is not what makes this story strong. What makes it strong is that even if she did get upset fast, even if she did create more conflict once the friends arrived, the original choice still matters. You do not get to hide a bad decision behind the reaction it triggered. That is one of the oldest tricks in broken relationships. One person lights the match, then acts shocked when the room gets hot. So now the story has moved from uncertainty to a much more painful kind of clarity. This was not just a rough morning. This was a final night that exposed how fragile and badly handled this relationship really was. And the more you sit with it, the harder it becomes to see Josh's behavior as random. Maybe it was impulsive. Maybe it was avoidant. Maybe it was both. But either way, Elise spent her last night there feeling alone while he chose a scene that made that loneliness louder. And just when it feels like the facts are finally simple, Josh comes back with his own version of what happened, and that is where the story gets even more unstable. Now the story gets harder, because this is the part where the clean version falls apart. Up to this point, it is easy to watch Elise crying alone, watch Josh disappear the next morning, and decide the whole case is already closed. And maybe emotionally, for a lot of viewers, it is. But the reason this moment holds attention is because Josh does not come back with silence. He comes back with his own version. And once that happens, the story stops being just about what happened and starts becoming about what the behavior underneath it really means. Josh's position is basically this. He says Elise agreed to his friends coming over. Then, once they got there, she turned the night into a fight. And on the surface, that version matters. Because if she did say yes, then this is no longer a story where he forced a party on her out of nowhere. It becomes a story where the night changed shape after it already began. That difference matters, but not in the easy way some people think. Because agreeing to something and feeling okay once it is actually happening are not always the same thing. People say yes to things for all kinds of reasons. To avoid tension, to seem easygoing, to keep the peace, to not look controlling. Then the reality hits, and the emotional truth shows up later. That does not always mean the person is dishonest. Sometimes it means they were already uncomfortable and only realized how bad it felt once the situation started playing out. So even if Elise did agree in the beginning, that still does not solve the deeper problem. It just changes the route that got them there. And that is where the blame game starts getting lazy. Because the easy argument is that Elise is emotional, difficult, dramatic, and impossible to please. The other easy argument is that Josh is selfish, careless, and emotionally checked out. The harder truth is that both people may be bringing something messy into this moment, but one person still created the setting that made emotional safety almost impossible. That is the part that should not get lost. This is where patterns start mattering more than isolated facts. Because if you only argue over whether Elise agreed to the gathering, you miss the bigger question. Why was this the kind of night Josh thought made sense at all? Why, on the final night before she leaves, did he choose a setup that was this easy to derail? Even if Elise did react badly, what exactly was this atmosphere supposed to achieve? Privacy was obviously needed. Tension was already there. The relationship was fragile, and his answer to that was more people, more noise, more confusion. That is why this part feels morally unstable. It does not let either side off cleanly. Elise may not have handled the situation well. She may have spiraled. She may have made the room even more uncomfortable once emotions started rising. That is possible. But a person can be hard to deal with and still be right about the thing that matters most. Those two truths can sit together. And a lot of failing relationships fall apart because nobody wants to admit that. Josh also benefits from something that happens all the time in tense couples. The calmer person often looks more reasonable at first glance. If one person is crying, upset, reactive, or accusing, and the other sounds flat and controlled, the flat one can look like the adult in the room. But calm is not always maturity. Sometimes calm is distance. Sometimes it is detachment. Sometimes it is a person who has already stepped halfway out emotionally and now gets to look composed because they are no longer fully invested in repairing what is breaking. And that is a major question here. Is Josh calm because he is grounded, or calm because he is gone already in every way that counts? Those are not the same thing. A calm person can still protect the relationship. A checked out person can sound reasonable while quietly letting it die. That is why his friend matters more than people may think. When even the person closest to Josh does not strongly defend the decision to bring friends over, that undercuts the cleanest version of Josh's story. It does not prove Elise is right about every detail, but it does suggest there was something obviously off about the choice itself. That kind of outside reaction matters because it tells the audience this was not just some private misunderstanding that only Elise would take badly. Even from the outside, it looked like a bad call. And once that settles in, the whole debate changes. Now it is not just about who raised their voice first or who made the bigger scene. It is about whether Josh is using Elise's emotional reaction to cover for his own failure in judgment. That move happens in a lot of bad relationships. One person makes a choice that destabilizes the bond, then once the other person reacts loudly, all the attention shifts to the reaction. Suddenly, the original wound gets buried under the mess of how the hurt person responded. That does not mean reactions do not matter. They do. But timing matters too. Cause and effect matter. If someone keeps putting the relationship in situations that feel disrespectful, unstable, or dismissive, then eventually the emotional reaction stops being a random outburst and starts looking like accumulated frustration. And that may be the bigger truth here. Elise may not just be reacting to one bad night. She may be reacting like someone whose trust was already hanging by a thread. That is what gives this section its tension. You can feel the audience splitting. Some people are going to say she agreed, then overreacted. Others are going to say none of that changes the fact that Josh's priorities looked wrong from the start. And honestly, that division is fair, because this is not one of those stories where every detail lands in a neat line. It is messy in the way real breakdowns are messy, but even inside that mess, one thing keeps sticking out. Josh's words and Josh's choices are not sitting comfortably together. He says he loves Elise. Maybe part of him believes that. But love gets measured differently when pressure arrives. Not in perfect speeches, not in abstract claims, in choices, in timing, in whether you make the person feel protected or pushed aside when the relationship most needs care. And this may be the night where that gap finally becomes impossible to ignore. Because once the facts start getting argued from both sides, the audience stops asking who sounded better and starts asking who acted in a way that made this ending feel almost inevitable. And just when that question gets sharp, Josh comes back into the room, shuts the door, and starts apologizing like that can still change the meaning of what already happened. Josh comes back, closes the door, and says sorry. More than once from what the audio picks up. And on paper, that should matter. In a simple story, that would be the moment where things start calming down. He returns. He apologizes. He still goes with her to the airport. Those are the kinds of actions people point to when they want to argue that somebody is trying. But this is exactly where the story gets heavier, because his apology does not repair the damage. It does not even really slow it down. It just sits on top of it. And that is the difference between apology and safety. An apology can acknowledge that something bad happened. Safety makes the other person feel like the same thing is not still happening while you are saying sorry. Elise does not seem to get that second part at all. She is not dealing with a man who created emotional stability and then made one mistake. She is dealing with someone whose behavior already made her feel pushed aside, and now the apology arrives after the message has already landed. That message being, when the relationship most needed care, she was not the priority. That is why this part feels so disappointing. It is not because Josh says nothing. It is because he says just enough to sound remorseful without really changing the emotional shape of the moment. He says sorry, yes, but the apology does not come with the kind of emotional ownership that makes hurt people breathe out and feel seen. Instead, the tension just keeps traveling with them. That tells you a lot. Because when an apology is really doing its job, it creates a little bit of relief even if the wound is still there. Here, there is almost none of that. The mood stays tight. The pain stays active. The mistrust stays right where it was. And part of the reason is that Elise is no longer only reacting to the original event, she is reacting to what the apology feels like. That distinction matters. A lot of people think the hurt person is being difficult if they do not soften once the word sorry is said. But that is not how this works when the apology feels shallow, rushed, or self-serving. At that point, the person hearing it is not just evaluating the apology. They are evaluating the mindset behind it. Are you really sorry for what this did to me? Or are you sorry we are still dealing with it? Those are two very different things. That is the trap Josh seems to fall into. He looks like somebody who wants the conflict lowered, but not necessarily somebody who fully understands why the conflict is still alive. He wants the apology to carry more weight than his behavior is allowing it to carry. And when that fails, the energy starts shifting from remorse into irritation. That shift is subtle, but it matters. Because once the person who caused the pain starts acting frustrated that the other person is still hurt, the apology stops feeling generous. It starts feeling like pressure. And pressure is exactly what makes a hurt person shut down even more. Elise does not need polished words at this point. She needs to feel like Josh understands the depth of what he did and why it changed the meaning of the night. But instead, what seems to come through is that he is tired of revisiting it, tired of apologizing, tired of the tension, tired of being in trouble for it. That is a very human reaction, but it is also a very revealing one, because it tells you that his discomfort with consequences may be louder than his concern for how deeply she was affected. That is why the apology lands flat. Not because apologies never matter, but because this one seems to keep circling back to him. His explanation, his frustration, his sense that he has already said sorry, his feeling that the issue should be cooling down by now. Meanwhile, Elise is still trying to process something that did not just hurt her feelings for a few minutes. It changed how she understood her place in the relationship. That is not a small injury. That is a structural one. And this is where the bigger relationship pattern starts creeping into view again. Because a weak apology is rarely just about one sentence delivered badly. It often points to a deeper mismatch in how two people handle emotional repair. One person wants the problem to be understood. The other wants it to be over. One person needs care. The other offers cleanup. One person is still in the wound. The other is already exhausted by the reaction to it. That gap can destroy a relationship even when both people technically stay in the conversation. It also forces a harder question about Josh's motives in apologizing at all. Was he sincere? Maybe. There's enough there to say he likely knew he had messed up. But sincerity is not the only thing that matters. Sometimes people are sincerely sorry and still mostly focused on escaping fallout. Sometimes they apologize because they hate the feeling of being the bad guy more than they hate the fact that they caused pain. And from Elise's side, that difference is huge. Because if she feels even for a second that his apology is more about getting the heat off than truly taking ownership, then the words stop creating comfort and start sounding like another form of distance. That is why the emotional ranking stays the real issue here. Josh's problem is not that he never returned. It is not that he never said sorry. It is that by the time he did both of those things, he had already revealed where Elise stood when the pressure hit. And once that kind of ranking becomes visible, it is very hard to reverse in one car ride and a few apologies. So now the story moves into a more serious place. The airport is not just where they physically separate. It becomes the place where Elise has to decide what this moment really means. Was this one awful mistake that should not define everything, or was it the final clear example of a pattern she can no longer talk herself out of? By the time they get to the airport, this is no longer just a bad ending to a rough trip. It feels like the whole relationship is being put on trial in real time, not in some loud, dramatic, movie-style way. In a quieter way that is actually worse, because now every word matters more. Every look matters more. Every bit of tone matters more. There is no next dinner to fix it, no tomorrow to cool off, no second chance later that night. This is the last real space either of them has to show what this relationship actually means when it is under pressure. And Elise does what people do when they finally hit that wall. She brings it back to the wound. She tells him he hurt her. She tells him he ruined their last night. That sounds simple, but it is not small. She is not only talking about one bad evening, she is putting a name on the thing that made this ending feel so bleak. The last memory they were supposed to share became one more reason she felt alone. And now, standing at the airport, she is not asking for perfection. She is asking him to understand the weight of that. But Josh does not rise into the moment the way this kind of scene usually needs. He does not suddenly sound more open, more urgent, or more emotionally present. He sounds tired. Tired of the argument. Tired of apologizing. Tired of going over it again. And that shift matters, because once that tone enters the conversation, the whole emotional balance changes. Now, Elise is no longer just the hurt person. She starts getting framed as the person keeping the hurt alive. That is a brutal power shift, because in the moment where she most needs tenderness, her pain starts getting treated like a problem in itself, not the thing caused by the relationship, not the warning sign that something serious has broken. The problem becomes her inability to let it go. And that is where the airport scene really sharpens. The issue is no longer just what Josh did. It is what he becomes when the consequences stay in the room longer than he wants them to. A lot of people reveal themselves most clearly at the end, because endings strip the performance away. Earlier in a relationship, people can still hide inside plans, promises, chemistry, and hope. At the end, especially in a pressured goodbye, you usually see the more honest version, not always the cruelest version, just the less edited version. The version that comes out when somebody is tired, cornered, and no longer fully committed to winning you back. And that may be what makes Josh's energy here feel so unsettling. He does not sound like a man suddenly realizing he is losing something precious. He sounds like a man already emotionally standing at a distance from it. That does not mean he feels nothing. That would be too easy, and probably too simple. He may feel regret. He may feel frustrated that things got here. He may even feel sadness in his own way. But sadness is not the same as effort. Regret is not the same as urgency. And in this moment, Elise does not need vague sadness. She needs some sign that what broke between them is hitting him at the same emotional level it is hitting her. Instead, what she gets sounds more like resistance, like he cannot believe this issue is still powerful enough to define the goodbye. And once that happens, a deeper question starts hanging over the whole scene. Did Elise come into this airport wanting a breakup? Or wanting proof? Proof that he would finally understand. Proof that he would finally protect the relationship instead of defending himself. Proof that he would respond to her hurt with something warmer than fatigue. Because a lot of endings are not as clean as they look. Sometimes the person who ends it is still giving the other person one last silent chance to show up differently. Not with perfect words, just with unmistakable emotional sincerity. If that chance existed here, Josh does not seem to grab it. That is what makes the scene feel so fragile. Elise is still speaking from pain, but underneath that pain there is likely a final test happening. Are you going to hear me now? Are you going to fight for this now? Are you going to show me that I matter more than your need to be done with this conversation? And the longer he talks like the problem is the size of her reaction, the more that test keeps failing. This is also where the relationship stops being about isolated details and becomes about interpretation. Because two people can live through the same event and come away with very different meanings. Josh may see a night that went wrong and an argument that got dragged too far. Elise sees a final night that exposed the truth about where she stands. He may think she is making one bad moment too big. She may think he still does not understand that the moment only hurts this much because it confirms a pattern she has been trying not to fully accept. That is why airport scenes like this hit so hard. They compress the whole relationship into a few final exchanges. The trip, the effort, the red flags, the mixed signals, the apologies, the disappointments. Everything starts collapsing into one live question. Can this still be saved? Or has one person already reached the point where continuing would mean betraying their own emotional reality? And once that question gets serious, the tone becomes almost more important than the actual words. Josh may think he is defending himself. He may think he is being honest. He may even think he is trying. But what comes through is distance, a kind of emotional flatness that makes Elise's pain look inconvenient instead of important. And whether he means it that way or not, that is the effect. He sounds less like a man trying to reach her and more like a man trying to survive the conversation. That is the moment where a lot of people stop negotiating with hope. Not because they stop caring, but because caring starts feeling too expensive when it is not being met. Elise may still love him in some form. She may still wish this had gone differently. But standing there in that airport, what she seems to be losing is not just the relationship. She is losing faith in the version of Josh she kept trying to believe was still in there. And once that faith starts collapsing, the ending becomes much harder to stop. Because now the next thing that matters is not whether she will say it. It is what he does when she finally does. And then it happens. Elise says what the whole airport scene has been moving toward. She says they cannot do this anymore. She says it is not going to work. And once that line is crossed, the story should become simple. In most breakup scenes, this is the point where everything explodes or everything collapses. Somebody cries harder. Somebody begs. Somebody chases. Somebody tries one last argument or one last promise. That is what people expect when love is supposedly on the line. But that is not what happens here. And that is exactly why this moment lands so hard. Josh does not rise up emotionally. He does not fight for the relationship in any visible way. He does not suddenly sound desperate, terrified, or broken open by what he is losing. Instead, what comes through is something much flatter, much colder, much harder to read. And that calm is what turns the breakup itself into only half the story. Because now the real shock is not that Elise ended it. The real shock is what Josh's reaction seems to reveal. This is the kind of moment that can change the meaning of everything that came before it. Because once one person finally says it out loud, once the relationship officially breaks, the other person's response becomes a kind of emotional X-ray. It does not always show the whole truth, but it shows something. And what Josh shows here is not urgency. It is not visible heartbreak. It is not even much panic. It is restraint, distance, maybe even relief. And if you are Elise standing there in that moment, that probably hurts more than one final argument ever could. Because anger at least shows charge. Anger shows that the relationship still has emotional voltage. Silence like this can feel worse. It can make a person wonder whether they were grieving something the other person had already left in their head weeks earlier. That is why this part feels so unsettling. Elise is clearly carrying pain, disappointment, and the collapse of what she hoped this trip would mean. Josh seems to be carrying something else entirely. Maybe regret, maybe discomfort, maybe nothing as dramatic as relief, but certainly not the same emotional weight she is carrying. And that mismatch matters. Emotional asymmetry is one of the cruelest parts of breakups. Two people can walk out of the same relationship and still be living in completely different emotional realities. One person is mourning the future they were still trying to believe in. The other is exhausted, detached, or simply ready for the tension to be over. That difference can be more painful than the breakup itself, because it forces the hurting person to realize they were not standing in the same place all along. That is the question hanging over Josh now. Is this just his personality? Is he naturally stoic, naturally flat, naturally not expressive under pressure? That is possible. Some people do shut down instead of break down. Some people get quieter when emotions are too big to manage in public. That is the kindest read. But even the kindest read does not erase the effect, because regardless of what is happening inside him, what Elise is seeing is a man who is not reaching for her as she walks away. And when somebody has spent a whole relationship trying to figure out where they stand, moments like that feel final in a way words cannot soften. And there is another harder possibility too. Not that Josh feels nothing, but that maintaining this relationship had already become more draining to him than losing it. That sounds harsh, but sometimes that is exactly what a flat reaction means. Not joy, not cruelty, just release, the end of effort. The end of a dynamic that had become too exhausting to keep carrying. If that is even partly true here, then the breakup hurts Elise in one way and frees Josh in another. And that is a brutal emotional imbalance to watch. It also raises a question about what Elise may have still wanted from this moment, even if she was the one ending it. Because people do not always break up in a clean emotional state. Sometimes they know they have to end it, but part of them still wants the other person to finally show the depth that was missing the whole time. One real display of feeling. One unmistakable sign that the relationship mattered enough to fight for. Not because it would necessarily change the outcome, but because it would make the loss feel shared. It would make the ending feel less lonely. Josh does not seem to give her that, and that absence may become the final receipt. Because by now, this is no longer just about the party, the friends, or the apology. It is about whether Josh ever met Elise at the same emotional intensity she kept bringing to the relationship. She may have been more reactive, more expressive, maybe even harder to manage in conflict. But moments like this make people ask a different question. Was she asking too much? Or was she asking the wrong person for the kind of emotional effort she needed? That is why calm can feel crueler than conflict. Conflict at least gives the illusion that both people are still in the same emotional event. Coldness makes one person feel like they are ending something alone. It turns a breakup into an exposure. You start realizing not only that the relationship failed, but that the emotional labor inside it may have been uneven for longer than you wanted to admit. And this is where the scene gets clarifying in a way that almost works against Josh, whether that is fair or not. Because when Elise finally draws the line and he responds with such little visible fight, it becomes very easy to look back and think maybe he emotionally left long before this day. Maybe the airport is not where he loses her. Maybe it is just where she finally catches up to the distance he had already created. That does not automatically make him evil. It does not even prove he never cared. People can care and still fail badly. People can care and still check out. People can care and still become emotionally unavailable when the relationship demands something deeper than they are willing or able to give. But from Elise's side, the distinction may not matter much anymore. Because whatever he feels privately, what he shows publicly, is a man who does not move toward her when it counts most. And once that happens, the breakup starts feeling less like a sudden collapse and more like a confirmation. Not proof that one night ruined everything, but proof that the relationship had been running on unequal emotional effort for longer than either of them wanted to say out loud. Which means the last part of this story is no longer about the goodbye itself. It is about stepping back and asking the harder question the airport scene finally forces into focus. Was that final night really the cause of the breakup, or was it just the clearest version of what this relationship had been all along? By the end of this, the easiest mistake would be to treat the breakup like it came from one ugly night and nothing more. That is the clean version. It is also the weaker one. Because the more Elise talks about what went wrong, the more it becomes clear that the final night did not create the whole problem. It exposed the shape of it. That is why the list of issues matters, but not in the cheap way people sometimes use a list. This is not about piling complaints on Josh just to make the breakup feel more justified. It is about seeing the pattern those details create when you put them together. The work situation, the son, the living arrangement, the friends, the partying, the personality, the avoidance. On their own, each one can sound manageable. Each one can sound like something a couple could talk through if the connection underneath felt solid enough. But that is the point. For Elise, the connection underneath never seems to stay solid for long. Every one of those things added pressure, and instead of pressure bringing them closer, it kept showing her how little emotional safety this relationship could naturally hold. That is why the final night hit so hard. Not because it was the only bad moment, because it fit too neatly with everything else she had already been trying to absorb. A lot of people can survive one disappointing night if the relationship underneath feels safe, attentive, and real. But when the relationship already feels shaky, one bad night does not stay one bad night. It starts collecting meaning from every earlier doubt that was never fully settled. And that may be the real answer here. Elise was not just reacting to being hurt, she was reacting to recognition. That is why her pain at the end feels bigger than the event itself. She is not only grieving what happened in the apartment, she is grieving the realization that the thing she kept hoping would finally feel secure never really got there. The final night was just the moment when hoping became harder than accepting. That is also why Josh leaving that morning felt so symbolic. On the surface, it was one more bad move, one more disappearing act, one more painful decision on an already bad ending. But underneath, it matched the same pattern that had been haunting the relationship. When closeness was most needed, he drifted. When clarity was needed, confusion showed up instead. When emotional protection was needed, Elise got distance, excuses, or delay. His leaving that morning was not powerful because it was dramatic. It was powerful because it made the whole relationship feel legible at once. The apology did not save it for the same reason. By then, Elise was not just listening for the word sorry. She was measuring whether his actions had ever really made her feel emotionally held in the first place. And once that question becomes central, apologies start losing power fast. Not because apologies do not matter, but because they cannot carry what the relationship itself failed to carry. If a person keeps feeling exposed, then sorry can start sounding like patchwork on top of a structure that was never stable enough. That is what makes Josh's calm reaction at the airport feel so final too. It was not only that he stayed flat, it was what that flatness seemed to confirm. That the emotional gap between them had probably been there much longer than either of them wanted to admit. Elise was still carrying the relationship as something with emotional urgency. Josh, whether by personality or by detachment or by plain exhaustion, was no longer meeting it at that level. That difference does not always show up clearly in good moments. It shows up in endings. It shows up when one person still needs the relationship to mean something active, and the other person responds like the hard part is simply being over. That does not make Josh a cartoon villain. Real life is messier than that. He may have cared in the ways he knew how. He may have believed he loved her. He may have genuinely felt that he tried. But part of what this ending forces people to admit is that love claimed and love felt are not always the same thing. A person can mean what they say and still leave the other person emotionally starving. A person can care and still become somebody who offers words, apologies, and just enough presence to keep hope alive without ever making security feel natural. And that may be the hardest truth inside this whole story. Elise was not asking for some impossible fantasy. She was asking for presence that felt steady when the relationship got hard. She was asking for the kind of care that does not have to be dragged into the room through conflict. She was asking for a bond where protection did not feel accidental. What she kept getting instead was uncertainty, mixed signals, and moments where Josh's actions made her question the very thing his words were trying to reassure. So when she says there were too many red flags, that should not be heard as a random stack of reasons thrown together after the fact. It sounds more like a person finally naming the pattern she had been trying to downplay while she was still inside it. And once she names it, the breakup stops looking like overreaction and starts looking like delayed clarity. That is the larger payoff here. This relationship did not die because one night was bad. It did not die because one apology was weak. It did not die because one airport goodbye went cold. It died because all of those moments lined up with the same emotional truth. Elise wanted a relationship where love felt like protection. Josh kept giving her a version where love sounded present in words but stayed unreliable in practice. And when those two definitions stay mismatched long enough, the official breakup is almost never the real beginning of the end. It is just the moment both people finally have to stop pretending the gap can still be explained away. That is why this story lingers after the goodbye. Not because it gave some huge explosive betrayal, but because it showed something quieter and in a way more painful. Some relationships do not fall apart in one spectacular crash. They fall apart when one person keeps learning over and over that being loved and being emotionally protected are not the same thing.